Hello and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. In this one I'm going to be adding a little bit of information to the small planet, growing planet theory, which relates to the origins of our planet and therefore us. As I've said in the past, you need to find information, understand the information and then apply it. You also must be ready to acknowledge when you are wrong and make adjustments to your thinking. Now, before I was born, the space race began. Technology had got to the point where they were firing rockets into the air and going out into space, landing on the moon and all sorts of stuff like that. But at the same time as they were going out into outer space, they were thinking of going to inner space as well, of going into the planet and seeing what was there. There was an initiative in the late 50s and started more or less the planning when I was born in 1962 that took, how many is that, 30 or 40 years to really complete. That was to bore a hole in the planet in Russia in the Kola Peninsula. So that's the Kola deep bore. They got all the funding and figured it out, and it was one of the very few holes that they have bored into the planet that was not to discover oil or look for oil. It was just purely scientific to see what was down there. Their aim was to go down to 15,000 meters. That's 15 kilometers. I'm not sure what that is in miles, but it's quite deep. It held the record for being the deepest hole in the world for at least 20 years, but recently there has been one even deeper. And instead of taking the 30 or 40 years to accomplish, this latest one near Qatar, I think, reached deeper than that in only 6 months. The technology that was developed during that time to bore this hole was revolutionary in itself. They figured out that once you got to a certain depth, you can't turn the whole drill bit, so they figured out how to hydraulically move just the drill bit. It took a long time and a lot of money, and eventually they gave up on it. It was 9 inches wide, which is about 20 centimeters or so wide, and they got down to 12,200, I think, or somewhere around 12 kilometers and a bit down into the Earth's crust. The temperatures got up to about 300 or 400 degrees, which was hotter than they were expecting, but it's still not hot. At that temperature, it wasn't molten. But the Earth was very plastic, which they found quite interesting, that by the time they got a new drill bit or the old drill bit out and put it back in 18 hours to pull it out and put the new one down, the hole had closed up, and they say it was like trying to drill plastic. Now this hole is still there as far as I know, but it's been very abandoned with the fall of Russia and all those sorts of things. The buildings and everything disintegrated. It's way up in the Arctic Circle, and so therefore they don't get too many visitors, so it's not a great touristic spot, but there are certain people, geologists and people, that do have an interest in it to go and see it. I think it's actually monumental what they did. Even though they're more efficient on drilling holes these days, the fact that they drilled this hole so deep just for scientific research was impressive. And what did they find, and what does that mean for small planet and growing planet theory? There were certain things that they found which were extremely interesting and entirely unexpected. Their seismic theories of those days was totally turned upside down, and they found they had to rethink their entire seismic geology of doing seismic readings. They expected that about 4 to 7 kilometers down there would be a change from one kind of rock to another kind of rock, but they found that was not true. What the seismic data was giving them was a region of fractured rock. And that fractured rock was full of water. This, to me, is extremely important and monumental. It means that, as is written in the Bible, in the book of Job and in different places, And in Genesis, in the flood, it says that there was water under the crust. In biblical terms, it was called the waters of the deep. There were vast amounts of water in cavern-like things under the earth crust, held up by pillars of rock. It appears that between 3 and 7 kilometres there is a crush zone. Now that, once you expanded it out when the planet was smaller, could have been a lot larger than the 4 kilometres of that region, but now it's compressed into approximately, though between 3 and 7, that's 4 kilometres of this kind of rock. At that area, it proves that our planet had water on the surface, below the surface, and above the surface, just as the biblical account tells us. Another very interesting fact is that a lot of hydrogen was coming out of the hole along with that water. That is a very good indicator to me, and we'll talk about this probably in another chapter, of where the water from the flood came from. And it's all to do with water. Water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. And so the fact we have water means there's hydrogen and oxygen together, and the gas hydrogen means there was an excess of hydrogen. We'll discuss that one later. Another finding at that area of water was another amazing world-breaking finding as well, is that they found microscopic plankton fossils at that depth also. It indicates, therefore, that there were plankton below the surface of the earth in these caverns filled with water. Between 3 and 7 kilometres, expanded as much as was at the time when our planet was smaller. That also is biblical, saying that there were animals, the beasts and the creatures of the deep, saying that there were creatures living in these caverns of water below the earth's surface. It really helps to stretch your mind to think about that. So there was water between 3 and 7 kilometres down. There was hydrogen. There was plankton, and that all indicates or supports the theory that the earth was very different to what it is now with water below the surface. Another point to mention is that in the biblical Garden of Eden there was a spring where 4 rivers started. It's basically a hole in the crust that was leaking the water from below. That water was coming from the caverns below the Earth's crust, coming up and running out in 4 rivers. And those 4 rivers went into the shallow seas that were on the surface of the planet. Biblically it says there was no rain, and that comes into the next topic, I think. But the Kola Hole, which was the world's deepest hole for 20 years, as a scientific experiment, they developed technology to drill holes more efficiently and better, and they found these amazing findings. It's interesting. I hope you find it interesting too.